Hi, last week I published a video about Mali, which did very well. And in the video, I joked that I could make a 10-hour video, but I didn't really think that any of you would want to watch a 10-hour video. However, in the comments, a number of you said, yeah, actually, we would like to see a 10-hour video. Now, I'm not going to do that. I am not going to make a 10-hour video. However, I do reason that I could probably fairly easily put together a bunch of videos with a specific focus on a certain topic related to Mali and related to conflict in Mali, and that would be far more digestible both for me and for you. So in this video, actually, what I want to do is I want to talk about the Tuareg, about Mali's Tuareg community. Because if you've read anything in the past few weeks about Mali, which unfortunately has been in the news lately, although not for very good reasons, but if you were to read any article about Mali, probably you would encounter the word Tuareg, which begs lots of questions. Who the heck are these people and why are they in the news and what's going on? I'm going to try to answer those questions in this video. If you're new here, my name is Michael Shirkin and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. And as usual, if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. Thinks about hitting the thanks button here to toss some change my way. You could also buy me a coffee using a link in the description below. And don't forget, of course, to check out my merch because it's cool. All right, so I'm going to divide this video up into several parts. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put timestamps in the description below so that you can jump around from place to place. So part one, I'm going to talk about sources. I'm going to tell you what books I'm drawing my information from. And I'm going to do this both because I want you to know that I'm not getting my information from Wikipedia, and also because it's a way of recommending further reading. If you find this interesting, I highly recommend the sources that I referred to, so go and read. Part two, I want to talk about Tuareg 101. Who are the Tuareg? Where do they live? How do they live? Part three, I want to focus more on Tuareg. On northern Mali and on the Tuaregs who live up there in the social hierarchy, who lives there and how many Malian Tuaregs there are and how are they organized socially and politically. And this is where I'm going to get into the having to do with their clan structure and clan hierarchy, particularly with the dominant tribal confederation in Mali. So I'm going to get into all that in that section. Part four, Tuareg political history from roughly from the 1890s to independence in 1960. Part five, I'm going to talk about post-independence Tuareg rebellions in Mali. And then part six, I'm going to talk about Tuaregs today between JNIM, which is the jihadist movement that's causing a lot of mayhem in Mali at the moment. And then there's also the FLA, which is a Tuareg-dominated rebel group. And I'm going to talk to you about like where they fit in today and where they fit in contemporary Malian society today. So are we ready? All right, let's go. So part one, I'm going to talk to you about my sources. Now, the books that I'm going to talk to you about briefly are the books that really frame my understanding of northern Mali, frame my understanding of northern Malian politics, and also frame my understanding of who and what the Tuareg are. I know for a fact that I have a number of Tuareg followers, certainly on Twitter. Probably some of you are going to end up watching this video. If you think I've got things wrong, and if you have additional information to add, please, please, please be my guest. To come onto the comments and say, no, it's not like this, it's like that, or actually you're forgetting this point or that point. I really appreciate that, actually. I know what I know because I've read a bunch of books, which is very different from knowing about Tuareg because you live there, right? I've never lived in northern Mali. I've been to Timbuktu and I've been to Gao, but I can't say I had much of an opportunity to talk to the locals. As for the books, the best book in English, at least that I'm aware of, and it's really the only book I'm going to recommend in English, is this book here, which is called Disputed Desert. This is by a Dutch guy named Bas Lecoq. It's really very good. It covers a lot of ground about the origins, the whole history and the history of French colonization and the politics in the 90s and that kind of thing. It's an excellent book. If you can't find this, by the way, I believe I have found Bas Lecoq's PhD dissertation in a PDF form on the internet. And the difference between this book and the dissertation is really pretty small. So if you can only find the PDF on the internet, go for it. The other book, perhaps the book from which I really get most of my information from, and it really helped more than anything, is this book by the French scholar Pierre Boyer. I don't actually know how to pronounce this. Les Tuareg Kel Adagh. The Kel Adagh is somebody I'm going to be referring a lot to, the Kel Adagh Tuareg, because that's the most important of the Tuareg tribal confederations in Mali. Most important measured by the noise they make. And the trouble they make, not necessarily by their numbers, because in fact we have no idea how large they are compared to any of the other Tuareg confederations. This book is amazing. This book really gets into the whole thing from the, how they organized politically to their tribal structure and what happened when the French showed up and what happened in the 1990s. I think this was published in 1999. This is a tremendous book, and I'm going to be showing you later on some slides that are all drawn from his book, or reproduction slides that are in his book. So I want to make very clear that I'm crediting Pierre Boyer. So a lot of the stuff, the information, I didn't do any original field work in Mali. I haven't had the privilege of being able to do that. Pierre Boyer did, and as well as I think Bazalcock and some of the others. There's an adjacent book of scholarship by Gamou called Les Tuaregs. Here's another word I don't really know how to pronounce. Maiden, I don't really know. Maiden with the Tuareg confederation that dominated Mali and Niger back in the day. So it's a history from 1647 to 1896, which is roughly when the French, in conjunction with the Kel Adagh, basically broke the back of the Kel Maiden and divided them into two and weakened them. But it's a really, really interesting book. Lastly, there's another book that I want to highlight. Oh, there's also, here I'm showing you an image. I don't have a copy of it. There's a Georg Klute, his work on Tuareg. It's called Die Schwerste Arbeit der Welt. It's a phenomenal book. He did his fieldwork in Niger. So it's about Nigerian Tuareg, if I recall correctly, not Malian Tuareg, but it's pretty much the same thing. And he basically explains how it works, like how transhumans nomadism, which I'll discuss further, how it works. How do you actually survive up in the desert with flocks of goats and camels and that kind of thing? And it is indeed an extremely hard way to scratch out a living. And he documents it, and it's really a fabulous book. Now, my favorite book about Mali is this book by Amédée Marico. This is a memoir of this guy Marico, who was in the French army. And first in the French army and then in the Malian army. And it's called Mémoire d'un crocodile, so memories of a crocodile, memoir of a crocodile. And he was up in Kidal, I believe he was there in 1962 already when the Malian army first went up to Kidal to occupy it after the departure of the French. He was involved in the Tuareg rebellions of 1963 and also in the 1990s. And he has a really, really an interesting perspective on North-South relations and the sort of mutual ignorance and hostility between the Northerners and the Southerners. I absolutely love this book. With all that said, let's get cracking here. Part 2, Tuareg 101. Who are the Tuareg? Tuareg are a subset of Berbers, if you will. They speak a Berber language known as Tamashek. The Tuareg inhabit the central Sahel. So you look in the slide that I put together, this generally gives you an idea of sort of the Tuareg zone in the central Sahara and the central Sahel. So, if you will, they are mostly divided by the three countries of Algeria up in the top, and then to the left, Mali, and then to the right, Niger. But there's some spillover into Nigeria and to Burkina Faso. That's where they are. If you go further to the west, you're dealing with Arabs and Moors. And then if you go further to the east, you end up running into the Tubu, which are very similar to Tuareg in some ways. So if you're talking about Chad, Niger, Chad, Darfur, that's where you're dealing with Tubu as opposed to Tuareg or Moors. Historically, the Tuareg survived up there in the form of, or using this thing called transhuman nomadism. And transhuman nomadism it's really kind of bonkers, but basically the idea is that you move your flock around from place to place depending on your knowledge of rainfall patterns and your knowledge of where, and because of rainfall patterns, but also because of the rainfall patterns, the time of the year, and the altitude, you have an understanding, you have mapped out in your brain where there's likely to be more green stuff for your animals to eat than elsewhere. And so you know that in this certain area, there's going to be some green stuff. So you move your flock over there and then they eat. And then you know that next, so there's a circuit. The next thing in your circuit's going to be that other valley over there. So you can move your flock over to that other valley. And you wander from place to place based on your understanding of where you're going to find food for your flock to eat. So that's transhuman nomadism. It's an extremely difficult way to scratch out a living, but people do it. Tuareg also, I believe, generally survived and still survive to this day on trade. I mean, once upon a time, you had these great caravans, these camel caravans that would crisscross the Sahara in multiple directions, and they would carry salt, ivory, gold, ostrich eggs, slaves, of course, and really anything of high value that's readily transportable. And they would move back and forth. Not the only ones doing this, but this is what Tuareg would do. That trade still exists, by the way, but mostly now it's done by truck. And the cargo now includes everything from cooking oil to small arms. But there is human trafficking still, although now I think it's mostly in the form of migrants, people from sub-Saharan Africa who really want to make their way to Europe. So you take these caravans, you get these people to smuggle you across the Sahara in their trucks, and you get to the Maghreb, you get to North Africa, and then you get on a boat and you try to go across the Mediterranean to Europe. Tuareg are by no means the only people doing this, but they are some of the people doing this. They used to have a tourism industry in much of this area, which is gone now because of the terrorism, which is a good reminder of how the first victims of terrorism in Africa are Africans themselves and Muslims themselves. So there used to be, you could go to Mali or Niger and you could hire guides and you could go into the desert and you could do all sorts of cool things. And they used to have these amazing music festivals in the desert. And then there's the Paris-Dakar rally. All that stuff is gone. It's been displaced. And I think it's really very sad because that was an important source of revenue for a lot of the people who lived in that area, the whole tourism trade. I mean, they were like artisans and blacksmiths and people who would sell trinkets to tourists. Like, this is all good stuff. It's all gone. It's all gone. To be clear, there are also Tuareg farmers, there are urban Tuareg, there are Tuareg in the army, in the military, there are Tuareg in the police, there are Tuareg in the administration, there are Tuareg who are teachers, there are Tuareg who do all sorts of things. So it's really, really important. They are associated with transhumanist nomadism, but that's not exclusive. Like there's far more to Tuareg than simply that. This is simply the association that we have in our minds. Now, the Tuareg are organized in terms of confederations. So if you look back to this map here that I showed, you have three basic confederations. There's the one in Algeria called the Kel Adagh. There's one in Niger called the Kel Adagh. And then back in the day, you used to have this thing called the Kel Adagh, which has been kind of supplanted in power by the Kel Adagh in Mali. There are other tribal confederations in Mali, as I'm pretty sure there are other ones in Algeria and in Niger. I think there are at least, I guess you could say three, I think, in northern Mali. In Mali, you've got the Kel Adagh, you've got the Wilamiden, and then the Kel Ansar. Maybe it's a question of how you count them or what there is. When the French arrived in the area, this region of Central Sahel, Central Sahara, they had to contend with these tribal confederations one way or the other. Sometimes they made war, sometimes they didn't. The first French column that reached Timbuktu in 1893 was actually wiped out by the Tuaregs. They sent a second expedition under no less than Joffre, who became a hero during World War I. Joffre was more successful, and one thing that the French did this time around is they took fewer chances, but they also took the time to study the human terrain, if you will, to understand who's who and who's in control of whom. And they figured out, for instance, that the most powerful confederation in Mali was this group called the Wilamiden, and they also figured out that they could kind of undermine the Wilamiden by making a deal with two of the groups that were paid tribute to the Wilamiden, and thus were resentful of the Kel Adagh and also Kunta Arabs, which is sort of a subset of the Arab population up there. And that's basically what they did, and then they managed to basically become the dominant force. The French did until 1916 when there was a rebellion by the Wilamiden, which the French crushed using the Kel Adagh and the Kuntas as allies, and that really decisively not only set up French preeminence in the area, but this also was why the Kel Adagh ended up being really the top dogs in the hierarchy of northern Mali, and that's what the French froze in place. They made a deal with the Kel Adagh. You guys have responsibility for security up here, protecting your northern border. In exchange, we recognize your supremacy. And it was great. And that defines the Pax Gallica in northern Mali from 1916 up until 1960, when the French decided to just walk away and leave the region and allow Mali to become independent. There's a really big question that I haven't even addressed at all, and this is really tricky. The question is, how many Tuareg are there? How many? And the answer is nobody knows. There's no good answer to this. We don't know how many Tuareg there are in total, and we don't know how many Tuaregs there are in Mali. We don't know. It's totally unclear. I have never seen any credible data, in part because the censuses don't ask questions like that. So we have census data from 2022 on how many Malians live in any particular town or community, but what's the breakdown? Are they Tuareg? Are they Arabs? Are they this? Are they that? We don't know. We have some credible data regarding language use, and language use is a very crude proxy for ethnicity. For instance, Tuareg there's a Tuareg language called Tamashek. So if X percentage or X number of people say that their primary language is Tamashek, then you can presume that those are Tuaregs. But the information is very It's not very useful. For instance, it's not that detailed. I haven't seen like really good breakdowns in terms of community by community. Also, there are Tuaregs who might not list Tuareg Tamasheq as a primary language. For one thing, every Tuareg, I bet, certainly everyone I've ever met, speaks multiple languages. So Tamasheq is one of them. There are, most people agree, more Tamasheq speakers than there are actual Tuaregs. So if 3% of the population self-identifies as being a Tamasheq speaker, that is probably a larger number than there are of actual Tuaregs. But we don't really know, right? It's all sort of guesswork. It's a problem. In my last video, I said that roughly 10% of Malians, about 2.2 million people, live in northern Mali. So those are Tuaregs, right? Not really. I mean, most Tuaregs in Mali live in northern Mali, but most northern Malians are not actually Tuaregs. As far as we can tell, Tuaregs are a minority in northern Mali. How small of a minority? That is contentious, and it's really anybody's guess. In the town of Kidal, in the region of Kidal, Tuaregs are the majority. Anywhere else, not so much. They are a minority in Timbuktu, for example, and they are a minority in Gao. The majorities in both of those communities, I believe, are Songhai. Songhai are a different ethnicity with a different language, different people. In fact, the lingua franca in northern Mali is Songhai, not Tamasheq or Arabic. The Tuaregs that I've met are also Songhai speakers, and that's the lingua franca in the streets of Timbuktu or Gao. The best guesses, the best estimates that I have found are that Tuaregs only make up a single-digit percentage of the Malian population, and probably under 5%. So there are not a lot of Tuaregs anywhere in the world, and certainly not a lot of Tuaregs even in Mali. And even in the north, Tuaregs likely make up significantly less than half of the population, with the exception of certain specific communities like Kidal. Please bear that in mind whenever you hear or read anything suggesting that a majority of Northerners are Tuaregs. Likewise, that a majority of Northerners side with Tuareg rebels. Please keep this in mind. Part 3, Northern Malian and Tuareg Society. Now, we're really going to get into the weeds here, so bear with me. Buckle up. In northern Mali, we have this situation where Tuaregs are just one of many groups. So first of all, we've got Tuaregs and we have Arabs. And the Arabs are divided into different kinds of Arabs. For instance, there's something called the Barabish Arabs, and they're more towards the west in Timbuktu. We also have Kuntas Arabs, which are kind of overlap with a lot of the Kel Adagh Tuaregs. There are other Tuaregs. There's a valley called Tlemcen Valley, south of Kidal. There are a lot of Arabs who are called like Tlemcen Arabs there. They're different kinds, and they all have their own sort of affiliations in politics. And then you have all these different Tuareg subgroups that I'm going to get more in detail in this, but basically you've got Kalafela, you've got Idna, Nefergumusen, Shemenamas, all sorts of people. And towards the south, you have this whole other world of Tuaregs. You have the Kalansar and the Wilamiden Tuaregs, these two other confederations. So Tuaregs share the space with lots of other people, and most people in this area aren't even Tuareg or Arab, they're Songhai, and then there are Dozos and Bambar, there are all sorts of people up there. So Tuaregs share the space with other people, and then as we'll see, even within these Tuareg tribal confederations, there are all sorts of subgroupings and groupings. Tuaregs, in fact, have historically been organized into tribes and castes. You have tribes that are noble tribes. You have tribes that are commoner tribes, or they're vassals who would pay some sort of tribute to the noble tribes. You also have artisan or blacksmith tribes, and then on the margins you have groups that are descended from slaves. Among the nobles, there are some who define or derive their traditional status from having been warriors, and there are others who derive their status as being aristocrats from a religious authority that often is associated with an imagined, maybe real, who knows, descendants from Muhammad himself or Muhammad's entourage, which is tied to the Arab invasion of North Africa that took place way back when. Now I'm going to put that on pause, and I want to provide a shameless promotion for a book which I published recently via Amazon, The French Way of War, 8 Strategy Lessons for Today's Conflicts. This is a distillation of all of the work I've done for many years studying modern French military strategists from Foch right before World War I up until the present day, going over a lot of the biggies like Boff and Castex and some others. I think it's a great introduction to French military thought, and I actually think it's very, very useful for anybody. It helps you think about conflict and about strategy, and I think it helps you think about contemporary conflicts today. All right, enough of that. Let's get back to Mali. Let's focus in and drill in on the Kel Adagh Tribal Confederation. And I'm going to talk about the hierarchy that exists within the Kel Adagh Tribal Confederation. I'm pretty sure I could do the same with all the other Tuareg tribal confederations in Mali and Niger and Algeria. I haven't done it, and I haven't seen the books that do that, but I'm pretty sure that those books exist. As I said, you've got tribes and then you've got castes. So you've got, imagine like a dozen tribes, but these tribes are in like a pecking order. Some are noble, some are commoners, some are sort of sub-commoners or craftsmen or former slaves. So the chart here that you see, this is taken from Pierre Boyer, specifically I believe page 47. It's a fabulous book. The information is from him. This is his information. So I want to make this clear. I am crediting him. I have to credit him. I did not derive this on my own. What I've reproduced here basically is his distinctions here. And the top tier, so you've got a horizontal and a vertical hierarchy. The horizontal hierarchies are such that the blue-green stuff at the top, those are noble tribes. The gray ones are the vassals of those same noble tribes. So then there's like a hierarchy where I think the farther you are to the right on the slide, even if you're noble, the farther away you are from the center of power, which is to the left. And I think the same is reflected by the commoners. If you're a vassal to an elite tribe on the left, that might put you higher up the pecking order than if you're a vassal to a guy who's far to the right. Also, as part of this system, if you look to the top left, there's a part of the nobles that are put into a larger block. These are called the fora. These are sort of the crème de la crème. Sort of these are the aristocrats of the aristocrats. And then at the far left, at the top of the left, you've got the top dogs, the very top, the Kel Adagh. That is the tribe of the traditional leader of the entire Kel Adagh Confederation, and his title is called the Amenokal. So he's from the Kel Adagh. The current Amenokal of the Kel Adagh is a man by the name of Muhammad Ag Intalla. I believe he is the direct grandson or great-grandson of the Amenokal who first struck the security relationship with France in the alliance in 1916. The Amenokal does not exercise centralized command and control. It's not like, King Louis XIV who would issue some edict and everybody needs to march and step and do exactly what he says. Otherwise, like off with their heads. It's more fractious than that. But he at least has some moral authority and some status and some real power. It's just, what the Amenokal's family does is very important. If you look at this hierarchy, just sort of go back to this, the theme, as I mentioned before in my Mali video, is that when the French showed up, they put in place a hierarchy, or they froze a hierarchy. So they froze the internal Kel Adagh hierarchy and established the Kel Adagh on top of the general hierarchy of northern Mali as part of the deal that they made. When the French left, however, the whole thing began to unravel, such that any subordinate group wanted to raise its position relative to everybody else, while the superior groups wanted to defend their position relative to anybody else. There's also a geographical overlay. This is also from Boyer's work, and just to give you the idea that some of these different subsections have like a geographical location, the Kel Adagh being up against the Algerian border, but then you've got all these other subsections which tend to be predominant in certain areas like the Idnan or the Shamanamas or the Afrogramus. And some of the more troublesome of the actors in northern Mali have been elite Kel Adagh tribes who are elite, but they're not elite enough. So they're sort of jealous of the groups that are even more elite than they are, and they're anxious to assert themselves vis-a-vis those who are more elite. And even if you look at Iyad the Ghali, he's the old Kel Adagh warlord who now is the emir of JNIM. He's from the Ariakan tribe, the Ariakan being the number 2 tribe in the Confederation. One theory about his turn to jihadism is that he always really wanted to eclipse the power of the Amenokal. He wanted to be the Amenokal, but he can't be the Amenokal because he's not Kel Adagh, he's Ariakan. So one way of eclipsing or making himself more prominent vis-a-vis the Kel Adagh is by becoming more Catholic than the Pope, because the Amenokal and the Kel Adagh Confederation traditionally has like an ecclesiastical position because they claim to be descendant from the Prophet Muhammad. And I think that this complicates our understanding of these rebellions and the political objectives that they had. When you look at Iyad the Ghali in the 1990s, he was in charge of a rebel militia, a Kel Adagh militia called the MPA, which I think was the popular movement for Azawad or Abazawad. They ostensibly rebelled against the state to advance Tuareg autonomy, but perhaps at least as likely they were really fighting to defend or assert the Kel Adagh, the Afora ascendancy over everybody else. Sometimes you could say that he was fighting for Tuareg in general. Sometimes he's really fighting for his Tuareg in general. It's hard to say. Meanwhile, his enemy is this guy named Gamou, Hadj Gamou, who's now a general in the Malian military. He also was active in the 1990s. He also had his own militia in the 1990s. But he was from the commoner caste and also from the Widamidan confederation, and he was fighting to overthrow the whole feudal system. So he had a very different objective than Ghali did during the 1990s. And then today, when you look at their conflict today, you wonder, it's not just are we for the state or against the state, but it's also what kind of power, what kind of order, what kind of political dispensation we want. So there's a fundamental split amongst many of the leaders up there based on their own kind of their origins and also their understanding of who should be in charge and why. Let's fast forward to today. The FLA, the Azawad Liberation Front, which claims to represent all the northern Malians, all of Azawad and all the Tuareg. It is predominantly Tuareg. And among the Tuareg, I would say, I'm fairly certain it is predominantly Kel Adagh, especially elite Kel Adagh, the nobles, and they're overrepresented. This was the case with the Amenokal before. This was the case for all the rebel groups that existed before, more or less. The reported leader of the FLA is Alghabass Ag Intalla, who is the brother of Muhammad Ag Intalla, thus he's the brother of the Amenokal. The number 2 leader of the FLA is somebody named Bilal Ag Acherif, who is generally identified as an Idnan Tuareg. Who are the Idnan? Well, if you go back to the chart that I showed you, the Idnan Tuareg are themselves nobles, parts of the Kel Adagh confederation, but a bit peripheral vis-a-vis the Caliphate and some of the others. Sometimes these guys act as if the divisions don't matter, but sometimes they act in defense of the collective Kel Adagh, but sometimes they act in the interests of their own specific subgroup. It all sort of depends on the situation. This means then you have to ask the question, how representative is the FLA of Northerners in general, or of Tuareg in general? I'm inclined to say not. Although, of course, we have no idea what percentage of Northern Malians are actually Tuareg, and we don't know what percentage of Malian Tuaregs are Kel Adagh, because we simply don't know. So part 6, let's talk about the Tuareg rebellions. I see 4 major Tuareg rebellions in Mali, plus the current phase, which I understand to be a continuation of the 4th. The first was 1963-1964, then the second was 1990-91 to 1996. Then we have roughly 2006-2009, some people say 2007-2009, it's fine. And then we have the 2012 rebellion, which I believe is really still going on now. We're just kind of in part 2 after this sort of French-imposed intermission, if you will. As for the 1963-1964 rebellion, this rebellion was led by and almost exclusively composed of Kel Adagh Tuaregs, specifically elite ones and some of their vassals. It was very brutal. It is the only of these rebellions that one could say concluded with a decisive Malian government victory. The government really crushed Tuareg rebels, and they did so brutally. They poisoned wells, they carried out summary executions, they terrorized communities, all sorts of unpleasantness. Amadou Marika's memoir of that period, because he was there, he was part of it, is really, really very helpful. And just he really helps explain how these Bambara-speaking southern soldiers and the Tuareg were just from different planets, and they couldn't communicate, they didn't understand one another. He talks about how the Tuareg would do things that they meant to communicate respect to the Southerners, but with the opposite. So the things that they did to communicate respect, the Southerners interpreted as disrespect. And then the things that the Southerners did to communicate respect to the Northerners understood to be signs of disrespect. So like they were always talking past each other, aggravating each other. There was also this problem that Mariko writes about, that he said that the Tuareg, apparently the Tuareg women have a reputation of being relatively, shall I say, free. And the Southern Malians show up with this idea in their head. So they basically think that they can help themselves to Tuareg women. You can imagine how that could cause problems. So he actually wrote, I believe, that a lot of the Malian officers would basically requisition women. Causes lots of problems. And then, of course, some of these women even get pregnant, which causes even more problems, right? Can you imagine how bad the blood can get if the two sides are acting out of complete ignorance in this way? And it's really bad. In any event, the military won, and you have peace. So you have peace in the 70s, you have peace in the 80s. In the 80s, there's a problem because there are these terrible droughts, and with the droughts come misery. A lot of Tuareg end up going to Libya looking for work, or Algeria. A lot of Tuareg end up in aid camps just to survive. The ones who went to Libya, none of them, like the young men, they got a taste for Gaddafi's militancy and radicalism. A number of them ended up in the Libyan army in this thing called the Islamic Legion, and some of them even saw combat in Chad and in Lebanon. Most of those who came back, whether from the aid camps or from Libya, they came back to Mali angry and politicized. A lot wanted there to be a revolution, but they didn't agree on what the revolution should be. So for some of them, a revolution means independence against the Malian state. For others, it might have been revolutions against the feudal order that had the Kel Adagh being at the top. They wanted to overthrow that in the name of the commoners, in the name of this group or that group. So there's a spirit of rebellion, but there's a lot of dissension with respect to what that's supposed to actually look like and to what end. So then you have the rebellion, which happens, it breaks out in 1991. It starts off as a rebellion against the Malian state, but ends up becoming a general melee among all the different northern armed groups. So people would take up arms in part because once the melee begins, you need to do your share, because otherwise everybody else is going to get something and you're not going to get anything. And then you have to defend yourself also against all the other groups that are trying to take advantage of you in this vast zero-sum game. So I believe the Kel Adagh faction started it. Other Tuareg groups jumped in, and then the Arabs jumped in, and Songhai, and everybody got involved. But often you'll hear that, no, everybody was involved in the rebellion. Everybody rebelled. Yeah, well, are they rebelling against the state, or are they rebelling against one another? I mean, everybody got involved, but at least half the time they're fighting each other as opposed to actually fighting the state. So, this rebellion generalized, but it was not a united rebellion. In the end, the faction that emerged as the strongest, that ended up having good relations with the Malian state, was Iyad Ghali's MPA, the popular movement for Azawad, which fought just as much to defend the interests of the Kel Adagh and the Afora, the elite Kel Adagh Tuaregs, as to assert any kind of northern autonomy. And you can see their shift away from rebelling against the state to sort of align with the state as a way of trying to secure their particular community's interests. Fast forward a bit to 2006, 2009, after some peace, about 10 years of peace, you end up being a rebellion or a string of rebellions. Sometimes they're called pocket rebellions, largely driven by individuals who are from communities that are elite but second or third rate Kel Adagh factions, with some others joining in. Iyad Ghali tried very, very hard to co-opt these and to sort of control them. And his strategy at the time, and he did this in cahoots with the Malian government, was to try to make the problems go away or contain them. So the Malian government didn't want to attempt to crush these rebellions. They didn't really have the strength to do it. What they wanted is for Iyad Ghali was for him to make the problem go away by somehow intervening and interposing himself and somehow containing it, create some sort of negotiated peace, and everybody can move on. Didn't really work that well. In 2012, we have a new rebellion. This rebellion is, once again, it's disproportionately Kel Adagh in terms of the provenance of the Tuareg leaders of this movement. So the MNLA is a predominantly Kel Adagh thing. And they started off quite well until they were joined by the jihadists, who joined in and became allies of the MNLA, some of whom are also Kel Adagh. In particular, there's a jihadist group that Iyad Ghali ended up starting at the end of 2011 called Ansar Deen, which is also Tuareg elites, Kel Adagh elites. The peace accords that ended the conflict of the 1990s, as well as the conflicts of 2006, 2009, and the conflict of 2012, to the extent that it ended, or rather paused, they all followed a familiar script. The Malian state promised decentralization, delegation, more local control and local autonomy, and more development investment. And the Malian military, basically, they go away or just tread lightly in the north to try to not to upset the balance of power. The militants, for their part, would disarm, go through some sort of DDR process, or either demobilize or integrate into the Malian military one way or the other. None of these pieces really held, and they didn't hold for several reasons. First of all, both sides are guilty of bad faith, both. Secondly, the rebellions were less about autonomy from Bamako, I believe, and more about local power struggles among the different northern communities. So in other words, if you rebel against the Malian state, and your purpose really is rebelling against the Malian state, and you want autonomy from the Malian state, and then the Malian state gives you autonomy, then you're good. But if that's not really what you're after, if what you're really after is you want to assert your dominance, your group's dominance vis-a-vis the other groups, but weirdly enough, you do this by going against the Malian state. And plus, this is just a way up there to assert yourself in your personal interests and make some money and make a name for yourself. Then if the Malian state gives you more autonomy, this doesn't really solve anything because that's not really what you're after in the first place. It doesn't quench your thirst for power for your group vis-a-vis the other groups, or your own personal career objectives or interests, or making a name for yourself, which means that eventually you're going to still be hungry and you're going to do it again, which I think is what we're really happening, what we see happening again and again. We also need to talk about why the state has not been able to crush the Tuareg and other insurgents up in northern Mali the way they could in 1963 and 1964. And I think it points to relative weakness and military weakness. I do not want to suggest that the average Malian soldier is inferior to the average Tuareg or Arab soldier. Like, that's silly. They both can be good soldiers. They both can be bad soldiers. I think that, to be more fair, it is just extraordinarily difficult for a regular state military to operate in Mali's far north. It's just so difficult. The lack of infrastructure, the heat, the linguistic problems, of course, you can't even talk to people. It's just hard to do, such that a relatively small insurgent force that is comfortable operating in that environment is going to thrive against a numerically larger, but really ultimately less capable regular force. Part 7, Tuaregs and jihadism. Traditionally, and we're simplifying here, Tuareg Islam is described as distinct from Wahhabi or Salafi Islam, or with Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. And it's often characterized as being Sufi infused and really, frankly, relatively tolerant and humane. I recall I once spent a very long afternoon with a Kel Tuareg holy man. He was so cool, but he would just sit forth and hold forth. He would just kind of pontificate, if you forgive the word. And he would say things like, and I think it was sincere. He said, like, how can I hate anybody? God created man, and how could I hate something that God created, right? That was like his take on religious tolerance. So how can you be intolerant of people? He was great. I don't know what's happened to him. I hope he's doing well, him and his family. They're really lovely people. But in the late 1990s, some Tuareg were exposed to new Islamist ideas brought to northern Mali by the Tablighi al-Jamaat, or the Dawa. It's a Pakistani group. So some people got a taste for it. How many, I don't really know. I think it was a small number, but some of those people turned out to be fairly influential. What we saw at work, though, with the Dawa is something that we see in many places in West Africa, and I'm sure beyond that, where in traditional society there's this alliance between the traditional religious authorities, the local imams, the marabout, the whatever, who represent sort of the local orthodoxies, and then the political establishment. And there's an alliance. Sometimes they're the same people, sometimes they're separate, but they support each other mutually. And in this context, what happens is that if you're not happy with the political status quo, this often can translate into discontent with the religious status quo, and vice versa. So if you don't like the status quo politically, you push back against the religious status quo, or something like that. And often what happens is that, and this is how Islamism, or more hardcore versions of Islam, gains ground in contemporary Africa, is that one rebels against the status quo, the establishment, by moving to the right of the religious authorities, by saying the religious authorities, the Islam of the established religious authorities isn't pure enough. It's corrupt. So I, in the name of fighting corruption and fighting weak religious practice, in the name of a pure form of Islam, I'm going to offer an alternative to the establishment of Islam, which of course also is a threat to the political establishment. And Algeria's jihadists showed up in northern Mali, the GSPC, which is the Salafist group for preaching and combat. They moved into northern Mali, and there was substantial, just around like 2003, 2004, there was substantial evidence that local Tuaregs were cooperating with these guys, selling them things, which raised lots of questions. Are these guys jihadis? And the consensus answer was that no, the Tuaregs are not jihadis. Tuareg Islam is not jihadi. That's not who these people are. But these are business opportunities. Most people there are desperately poor. It's extremely hard to make a living up there. So if somebody shows up, some group shows up, and they're camped out in the desert, and they come in Intalla, and they say, hey, could you sell me some diesel fuel? The answer, of course, is yes. And along with that, hey, can you throw in some packs of pasta and this or that? Like, absolutely. So there's almost a business relationship between the Tuaregs and the jihadists. And then there's growing evidence that some Tuaregs and some people are kind of develop a taste for it. We also see evidence that Iyad himself, who was the leader of the Ifora MPA militia in the 1990s, and now becomes sort of like the big problem solver for the Malian government and Mali's president ATT, he gets more and more involved with the GSPC. Again, the question was asked, why is he a jihadist? And the answer usually, in fact, is something I argued, no, he wasn't. It's just pragmatic. And then when it turns out, no, he shows signs of being an Islamist at least, well, okay, you can understand this, increasingly understand this in terms of his wanting to be more Catholic than the Pope. He'd like to be the Amenokal. He'd like to be the leader of the Kel Adagh confederation. He can't be because the leader of the Kel Adagh confederation is from the Calafela tribe. He's not. He's Iriakan. So what can he do? Well, he can kind of eclipse or undermine the authority of the Amenokal by being, as I said, more Catholic than the Pope. And at some point, he served as Mali's ambassador to Saudi Arabia, where reportedly he went further down the Islamist rabbit hole, and he emerged from that being much more of a convinced Islamist. But people were still questioning, all right, well, is he in bed with GSPC? And then when GSPC became a QAM, is he aligned with them? What's he actually doing? He never actually joined a QAM, but he moved in the same direction. He was more like a compagnon de route, a fellow traveler more and more. In late 2011, Iyad, because he tried to take over the MNLA but failed. Because remember, the MNLA was run by other Ifora elites who resented those who were more elite than them. And he was more elite. So Iyad tried to take over the MNLA, but he failed. So he went and started his own group, Ansar Din, which is a jihadist group. And then it's also populated or led by Ifora elites, Kel Adagh elites. And then they joined up with AQIM and some of the other jihadist groups to first align with the MNLA and then to hijack the rebellion that the MNLA started, push them out of the country such that by the June of 2012, they now controlled half of the country. Until the French showed up. Some of the members of Ansar Din abandoned it, basically as soon as the French showed up, as soon as the French started dropping bombs. Among them is Alghabass Ag Intalla, who is the brother of Muhammad Ag Intalla, who's now the Amenokal. He quickly ditched the Ansar Din in order to form his own thing that's sensibly more moderate, and now he's presumably putatively the head of the FLA, which is the latest iteration of the MNLA. Sorry for all these acronyms. Where do Tuaregs stand today? So today we have this situation where we have JNIM, which is this coalition of jihadist groups, and the FLA, which is a northern rebel group, are in cahoots, and they are beating the crap out of the Malian state. The part of JNIM clearly has Tuareg. Then you have the FLA, which, despite what the FLA will say about itself, is also predominantly Tuareg. And of the Tuaregs involved in both JNIM and the FLA, I am quite certain that they are predominantly Kel Adagh Tuareg, meaning the other Tuareg confederations, the Ouida or the Kel Ansar or anybody else, they are much less involved, certainly in terms of proportions to the relative population. There are today many Tuaregs in the military, although they tend to be Imrad Tuaregs, meaning these are commoner Tuaregs who are hostile to the Kel Adagh, hostile to the Kel Adagh elites, and aligned with General Gamou. There are political reasons why they side with the Malian state against the Tuareg separatists, because the Tuareg separatists who claim to be rebelling in the name Tuareg are, from their point of view, are really rebelling in the name of the Kel Adagh elites. The Malian government really makes this worse by recruiting Imrad Tuareg and talking about the Imrad Tuareg as if they are the only loyal Tuareg. I've read that in Malian military publications. Like the Imrad Tuareg are the only ones who have always been loyal to us, which is totally not true. Totally not true. And it just infuriates things and makes matters worse. And also means that when the Malian army would send Tuareg troops into a place, they are sending Imrad troops who are sort of the hereditary enemies of the noble Tuareg. It's often adding fuel to the fire. It creates the problem. So which of these groups, JNIM, FLA, the Malian military, which of them is more representative of Tuaregs as a whole or of northern Malians as a whole? I strongly, strongly doubt that most northerners are in league with either JNIM or the FLA. I also doubt that most Tuareg are in league with JNIM or the FLA. The best available evidence suggests that jihadist Tuaregs, which exist, are a small minority of the overall Tuareg community. And then the Tuareg community is a small minority of the overall population of northern Mali. The Tuareg rebels who have rallied behind the FLA rebel group, right, are themselves also a small minority of the overall population of Malian Tuareg. My hunch is that there are more pro-FLA target Tuaregs than there are pro-JNIM, but we really lack hard numbers. We don't know. Nobody can quantify this with any precision. We don't even know how many Tuareg there are. We don't know what percentage of the population is Tuareg. We don't know what percentage is the Kel Adagh confederation. So it's impossible to say with any certainty anything about how representative any of these groups are, but I really think it's safe to say that they're just not, which adds to the problem. So you could read the Tuareg advocates for the FLA and think, oh, I sympathize with them. They want independence, they want autonomy, the government treats them badly. But who is they? They claim to represent everybody, but do they really? And then it becomes kind of more fragile. Like they have legitimate grievances, but also it's a minority of a minority. So ideally you deal with this through elections. That way you settle on this, but that's a whole other topic. Maybe there'll be another video, like why doesn't democracy work in Mali? Yeah, actually that'd be a really good idea for another video. Okay, let's stop there. Thank you very much. I hope that you found this informative and interesting. If you look in the description, you'll see links to my social media, my Substack, my Twitter, my Blue Sky, my own website, michaelshuriken.com. Don't forget to pick up one of my book, which is awesome. And stay tuned. There's plenty in the pipeline. Bye-bye.